It's referred to as the Dark Ages for a reason, and yes, the elites had a much easier time of it with their palaces, fine clothes, and fancy food, but for most people, the Middle Ages were a gloomy and miserable time to be alive. Life was monotonous, dangerous, and dirty. Now, we don't want to fall into the classic trap of assuming it's all bad. We know there were some good parts, such as being in touch with nature and being close to family. There were also plenty of festivals to alleviate the boredom and slog, but they were all tied in with the church and their strict rules. On the whole, just existing was pretty grim, and life expectancy was low, which some people probably found a blessing considering the harsh conditions in which they lived. Let's travel back in time to the Middle Ages and take a look at some of the hardships that our ancestors endured. But first, a quick message from our sponsor, me. Some of you may remember that when I'm not diving into the wonderful world of medieval history, I front a band called Default Mode Network. We've just finished our second EP, and the first single from that, called Autopilot, came out today. Now, it has very little to do with medieval history, but the reason I'm mentioning it on this channel is to ask for help from anyone who listens to rock music, particularly alternative rock, or in the case of this new single, anything with an influence from bands like Green Day. Not only is it amazing to hear everyone's thoughts on the music, but the more streams, saves being put in playlists and shares we can get on the streaming platforms, the more ears that the songs get pushed out to on the algorithm, so it seriously is a huge help every time you guys stream the music. I've linked the song below, but to keep up to date with a few fun things that I've been working hard on, you can also find us here on YouTube or Instagram. I'll also put a link to join our mailing list for anyone interested in some more personal and behind-the-scenes content. I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts on the music, and as always, I seriously appreciate the support from everyone for the band and everything our team does with this channel. It really is a dream job. Thanks again, you guys, and now for today's video. Welcome to Medieval Madness. Constricted. The average villager hardly ever ventured beyond the immediate surroundings of their home. There was no jetting off on a beach holiday for the medievals. Those that did travel, perhaps to go on a pilgrimage or to migrate to the cities for work, found that travelling was difficult, slow, and dangerous. You either walked, rode, or went on a horse and cart. Roads, at least the ones that existed, weren't ideal, as most travellers had no protection and the risk of being robbed, assaulted, and even killed was very high. Inns were few and far between as well, so sleeping outside was really your only option, and then not only did you have to worry about thieves, but the weather and wild animals too. For the average medieval, there were no maps, and any lands beyond their own village or town was a complete mystery. For most men, the only time that they got to see anything of the world was when they were recruited into their lord's army and had to go off to fight a war. Crossfire. Speaking of war, the Middle Ages was not a particularly peaceful time, and there was always a conflict happening somewhere, as feuding nobles and struggles between kingdoms were common. Peasants could be conscripted at any time to fight for their lord or king and end up on the front line of a bloody battle. Oftentimes, they weren't even sure what they were fighting for. Whenever any army decided to invade, it was always the common folk that got caught in the crossfire and suffered. During the Viking Age, from around the year 800 to 1050, thousands of men, women, and children were killed, and villages destroyed by the marauding Northmen. Not to mention the many people, both young and old, who were carried off and sold into slavery. After the Norman conquest of England in 1066, William the Conqueror ordered the harrying of the north, which saw the slaughter of thousands of people and livestock and the looting and burning of large areas of land in the north of the kingdom. It was a violent time when anyone at any time could see their meagre homes and belongings pillaged, and the lives of either themselves or their loved ones cut short. Expendable. Any male peasant over the age of 18 was at the mercy of their feudal lord when it came to military service. Nobles said jump, and their vassals asked how high. It didn't make any difference whether the kingdom was under the threat of an imminent invasion or just a petty squabble with the local count from up the road. If you were called up for duty, you had to go. Soldiers were exposed to the rain and cold, decent food and clean water were scarce, which of course meant that disease was rife. Known as the Bloody Flux, dysentery was an indiscriminate killer when an army was on the march. On the Agincourt campaign in the early 15th century during the 100 Years' War, King Henry V of England lost up to 5,000 men from the disease at the Siege of Harfleur. There might be as many as 2 out of every 10 peasant men in service at any one time. During the summer months, however, a great deal of work was needed toiling in the fields, so that number would drop significantly. King Harold made the mistake of sending home his troops to bring in the harvest just before the Viking Harald Hardrada struck the north coast of England in 1066. Farming was back-breaking work, but you were much less likely to die doing it. And I can imagine that once on the front line of a battle, you would probably wish that you were back there in the fields. The good news was that most of the time the battle didn't actually kick off. Both sides would show up, make a lot of threats, guesstimate their chances of winning, and then make a deal. The bad news was if the fighting did get underway, your army training would have been minimal and you had to take your own weapons. There were no fancy swords and armor for the peasantry. Unprepared and ill-equipped, you wouldn't have had much of a chance when it came to hand-to-hand combat, and on top of all that, if you did survive, you usually had to make your own way home, sometimes from a foreign country with little to no rewards for your efforts. Chattels. Same-sex marriages were a definite no-no as far as the medieval Catholic Church and society were concerned, and there were usually harsh punishments for those who were caught engaging in it. Usually months, sometimes years, were spent on the preparations of a marriage between members of the nobility. They were almost always planned with some political or financial goal in mind. Children were often betrothed to one another at a very young age with no consideration for their future happiness whatsoever. Girls especially were treated as a prize to be sold off to the highest bidder. The mother of King Henry VII of England, Margaret Beaufort, was married to her husband, the 8-year-old John de la Pole, when she was just 6 years old. Then remarried to Edmund Tudor, 1st Earl of Richmond, who was 24 when she was just 12. As far as peasantry went, getting married was completely different. For a start, it was much easier and a lot more spur of the moment. So unplanned, in fact, that it was sometimes difficult to prove that it had ever actually happened. Sex before marriage was, of course, condemned by the church, even when it was between 2 consenting partners of the opposite sex. Anyone caught up in the heat of passion could simply declare themselves married and then get it on. This was because if you wanted to become husband and wife, then you could just declare yourselves hitched, and you were. Many men, or women for that matter, might try to take advantage of this situation and just say they were married to you for another notch on the bedpost and then deny ever agreeing to the union. Without a witness there was no way of proving the words had ever been said, and many women were taken advantage of by some devious philanderer in this way. Misogyny. Speaking of medieval women, most of them had it pretty tough in the Middle Ages. Their lives were not their own, and rather run by the male figures around them, such as fathers, brothers, husbands, and even sons. Once married, noblewomen did have slightly more influence in their lives, and some royal ladies became quite powerful, like Margaret Beaufort, who, despite her shaky start as a teen bride and mother, was instrumental in the rise to power of her son Henry Tudor, who defeated Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. But, as we have already seen, they were mostly elite pawns to be moved around and forced into unwanted marriage alliances that would benefit their family or their father's ambitions. According to many medieval theologians, women were just seen as inferior tempters of men and responsible for Adam being thrown out of the Garden of Eden by God. A woman couldn't inherit or possess any property in her own name. They couldn't serve as lawyers or judges or represent themselves in court. According to R. Howard Bloch's article about medieval misogyny, quote, "Legal penalties for the same crime often differed substantially, as in the punishments for adultery, for bearing children out of wedlock, for beating one's spouse." In the early Middle Ages, female adulterers were often mutilated or exiled, some were even murdered, males often got just a slap on the wrist and a fine. Women rarely had any opportunities for education and had to concentrate on household duties and childbearing. Giving birth in the Middle Ages was a dangerous business, and many women died in childbirth or shortly after, and of course this includes noblewomen and even royalty. Many of the midwives and healers who tried to help these women give birth safely were seen as outsiders and treated badly, often ostracized and even accused of dabbling in the occult. As the Middle Ages came to a close, more and more women were accused of witchcraft, especially after the publication of the treaty Malleus Maleficarum, a guidebook to rooting out witches written by the German clergyman Heinrich Kramer in 1486. Pressure. Men didn't have such an easy ride in the Middle Ages either, especially when it came to struggling to fulfill their conjugal duties in the bedroom. There was no psychological help available or any small blue pills, and men couldn't expect any sympathy from their communities or even their own wives. Procreation was a serious business during the Middle Ages. As far as the all-powerful church was concerned, it was the only reason that couples should be having sex in the first place. Any failure to produce children was placed squarely on the shoulders of the man. That meant that women were well within their rights to demand intimacy with their husband. Matrimony was considered a sacrament and breaking up practically unheard of, but failure to comply in bedroom shenanigans could result in legitimate grounds for an annulment. There are several cases of medieval women being granted a divorce because of their husband's inability to perform. Embarrassingly, impotence trials were held in public, and the man in question would find himself having to call on other women such as sex workers to attest to his virility, and even have his little soldier stand to attention in front of the jury. But if that doesn't work, you could always just reverse Uno card and blame your impotency on witchcraft. Contagion. Medieval cities were nasty places. The first thing to hit you when you walked through any city gates was the horrific smell. In London, the main thoroughfare that led in from Newgate wasn't called Stinking Lane for nothing. There were no indoor plumbing systems, and refuse collection wasn't exactly up to modern standards, so the streets were awash with all sorts of waste. Behind most streets, there were shared latrines with cesspits. They were supposed to be regularly emptied by the gong farmers, but this wasn't always the case, and after heavy rain, feces would often overflow. The houses were tightly packed in, and the people were tightly packed together. Not great when you consider that most people only bathed a few times a year. Hot water was a luxury, and personal hygiene practically non-existent. Yes, there were public bathhouses, but they were often used for other, more lecherous purposes and weren't very hygienic. Many couldn't afford what was a luxury anyway. Steam baths were cheaper, but wouldn't really have cleansed the body very well. This just meant that for the common folk, unpleasant skin infections, lice, and body odor were an everyday normality. All in all, medieval cities were a breeding ground for diseases. Diseases for which there were no real cures. In the 14th century, the Black Death ravaged Europe and wiped out as much as half the population. Spread by the fleas on rats, the bubonic plague wasn't the only sickness that